Hi, welcome to the Dairy Hour Podcast, where rural charm meets personal growth. Join us as we milk every moment for wisdom, self-improvement, and mental wellness. I'm your host, Val Lavigne, a rural dairy farming mom with a passion for filling hearts while never forgetting to fill my own cup. Get ready for insightful conversations, empowering tips, and a splash of fun and laughs, of course. Let's cultivate growth, nourish our minds, and embrace the journey together. This is the Dairy Hour Podcast, where every episode is a breath of fresh air and the inspiration you need to be your best self. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Dairy Hour Podcast. I am your host, Val Lavigne, and I am joined by a very special guest today, Carly Hill, also known as Debt Free Mom on Instagram. I am hugely fangirling over Carly because she is one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram, and I followed her for 4+ years at this point. So it's been really, really exciting that she agreed to be on the podcast today and share some of her really great wisdom. Carly, how are you today?
I'm good, Val. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. And for those of you that don't know the behind the scenes, obviously this is take like 17, because why would technology not be an issue on something that has me so excited and like low-key nervous to begin with. So take 17, we're going to get it this time. Everything is going to go great. So Carly, if you want to start by telling everyone a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So like she said, my name is Carly. I run an Instagram and business called Debt Free Mom. So I am a mom of 4 kids. I have 3 sons who are 9, 7, and 5. And then I have a daughter who's 3. And I live in the Midwest. I'm almost exactly halfway between St. Louis and Chicago. So when people hear that I live in Illinois, they naturally think of Chicago, but I'm actually very far away from both in distance and in lifestyle from Chicago. So I'm much more like farm country. I have a business that I started right after I had my 3rd son. So before having kids, I was a special education teacher. Really wanted to stay home with my kids when I was teaching, but I also knew that there were some things about my finances that were really preventing that from being possible. And so at the time, between my husband and myself, I was earning more than he was. And we had about $26,000 in debt between student loans and cars, and very, very little money in savings. So when I did leave my teaching job to have my first child, I picked up 2 part-time jobs pretty much immediately and needed to continue working those. While I was working those, I really felt like what the situation around my finances is what was preventing me from having the option to even stay home. So I really took every extra dollar that I could find and put it towards paying down the debt and building up a hefty emergency fund in order to expand the options that I had. I don't at all think that every mom should stay home. I think a lot of moms should work and can work and do really wonderful things in the world by the jobs that they have. But I want them to have options. I don't want them to feel like the only reason they work is because of the state of their finances. So that's really what compelled me to use the time as I was staying home more to talk to other people and connect with them in ways that I couldn't who was physically around me. And so what I didn't have at the time was I did not have the resource of money to invest in starting up a business or doing something that way. But I did have the resource of time, in that I had a lot of time by myself at home, being the only adult. I guess I wasn't by myself. My kids were there, but no other adults around. And I could just chat on Instagram and connect with other adults that way. So I started talking on Instagram about being the person who was not receiving a paycheck at all. I had no paycheck with my name on it, but I was primarily managing our finances, and I was the one buying the stuff for our home and really making the decisions about when my husband received a paycheck, what did we actually do with it? And I started to realize that that is the much more influential position to be in a home. And so I really wanted to connect with other people who maybe also had those false beliefs about if you don't have a paycheck with your name on it, you're not contributing to the family finances. And so that's what I shared about was what are the things that I could do within the situation I was currently in to open those doors for my family and have the options that we wanted to have. So started that Instagram account in the spring of 2019, and it grew rather rapidly, connecting with so many other women around around the United States and really around the world, who also wanted to have those options and needed a little bit of guidance on what does that look like? What do we have to do with our money in order to pay down that debt, get rid of those payments so that we have options and we can really use our current income to its fullest potential. So now, several years later, that's what I do full time. I say full time because it's my only job. I don't work full time. I don't work 40 hours. I'm also still a primary caregiver for all these little children. But this is what our family does. And we really want to share that message with other people who feel the way that we did back in 2015 and 2016, that the state of our debt and our savings and our income was the thing stopping us from having the options that we wanted to have, and really help them to see that with a little bit of focused effort and time, we can get into a position of having those options. And it doesn't take doubling and tripling your income in order to accomplish that.
Awesome. I have just really enjoyed following your story over the last 4 years. And it's just so funny when you follow someone on Instagram and you're like, yep, I know all this. I've heard the story. I've listened to the podcast. I know like all the background. It's really neat to see the different things and just the world that you have opened up for, women like me, where it kind of makes you second guess, like, do I need to spend money on that? What would my money be best put to use for? Is this something that I can get secondhand? Is this something that I can, your favorite care creates contentment? Is this something that I can, kind of fix up and keep using instead of having to spend the money on something new? So that's really been great the last few years. And while I am really terrible at budgeting, and I do put some effort in sometimes, but sometimes I just don't. But it does, even if I'm not budgeting all the time, it makes me step back and think before I go ahead and spend money, which is also a really good thing, because I know you're the spender in the family, and I am also the spender in the family. My husband very rarely wants to spend money on anything, but I'm like, oh, but we need this. Oh, but we need this. Oh, wait, we need to get this for the kids. And he's definitely more of the, he just kind of expects his money to, he expects money to be there when he wants to get something, very rarely. But for the most part, I mean, he'll go, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks without really spending anything. So it's just definitely, I understand that role of how that spending works and how you're kind of the money manager and things like that. And as Greg says, I'm a dairy farmer, but I also have horses. And he goes, well, we'd be really rich if we didn't have horses, but you'd also have a miserable wife. So I guess we are. So, what kind of inspired you to get into budgeting and doing all of those different things? You touched a little bit about like how it started and, how you went from working to being a stay-at-home mom. I say that in quotes because you're about the same as I am. You're stay at home, but you're still busting your butt all the time.
Yeah. I always say that I think my kids would say I stay home, but that's not actually what I do.
Yes. So what kind of got you into like, what made you say we need to budget? We need to do this. Like, how did you get into that?
Yeah. So, similar to what I said before, what really was frustrating to me was that there was something that I really wanted to do, which was to not work full time, especially in a teaching job, while having really little kids, while having babies, but really noticing that the current state of my finances was what was stopping me. And at first I was naturally like what most people have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to is, well, we just have to make more money. That if our income was higher, all of these problems would just go away. And then I started to really think about people who were around me, especially my peers at the time when we were just getting out of college. And I had peers who were jumping into careers that automatically were paying them, at least double what I was, making just because they had jumped into accounting or, a lawyer or something that was much more known for a higher income. But then I started to see these high purchases that went along with it. And I am a very numbers minded person. I think in numbers. And I just started to think about the mental math of, well, sure, their income is a lot higher than mine is, but they're also living in a giant home and driving a brand new vehicle. So the math that I started to think about was, at the end of the day, the extra money that's available to them after you subtract all of the payments that they have now locked themselves into is probably very similar to what I have available to me because I don't have those high purchases. And so I started to question the assumption that a higher income would automatically solve my problems and started to ask, if a higher income does not by itself solve my problem, what could actually create a larger gap between my income and expenses? What actually could create a sense of freedom in my finances? And so I started to lean into, this is the income that my husband has, and in the short term it's not changing. What can I do? How can I affect the way that feels? And so budgeting was something that stood out to me as not a way to eliminate spending, simply as a way to plan out our money in advance so that we could make the most of it, so we could be as effective as possible. I mean, to lean into, a farming analogy or whatever, imagine being a farmer and putting no forethought at all into what you're doing with your animals or with your planting, having no, and being like, oh, we're just going to wing it. We're just going to let it go because putting myself on a set schedule is too restrictive. Well, we all know that is just going to crash and burn pretty much immediately. Like, you have to put this effort into this discipline into planning well in advance what you're going to do, and that creates the best outcomes. When we have a plan and we stick to it, it creates much better outcomes than trying to wing it. We might feel free because we're winging it in the moment temporarily, but the consequences of that do not feel free. We're not enjoying the consequences of that. So the same is true with our money, that by putting effort and time into thinking ahead of time what I want to do with my money that best serves my family in the long term, not just in the temporary, momentary comforts, that produces the outcomes that I want. That temporarily restricting my spending, for example, is going to create a more free long-term future. So if I want my money to feel flexible and if I want to have options, I do need to create some boundaries and some guardrails around how I use it in the day-to-day spending in order to open those doors. So that's what I really discovered was true. I started to tip my toes into budgeting. At the time, Kyle was paid every other Friday for his job. And then I had one part-time job that paid me once a month. And then I had another part-time job that was tutoring that paid me cash very sporadically. As I tutored this student, his parents would just give me cash. So we were kind of all over the place in the amounts and the frequencies of when we were paid. And I was trying to build a budget that was once a month because that was all I had ever heard. That is all I had ever seen. Any app, any template, any paper budget had always been, you plan out your month. So when you get to the end of one month, you kind of jot down what your bills are for the next month and you go from there. That really was not working for me. And I was running into real scenarios where I had on paper thought, oh yeah, we have plenty of money for this expense. And then the expense would hit our bank account and I would overdraft sometimes because the other paychecks that I had assumed would be able to be used were not actually there yet. Like once they came, everything would wash out fine by the end of the month. But during the month, I was running into scenarios where certain bills were due at times that was earlier in the month than some of our paychecks. And that was highly frustrating to me because I was like, I am doing all the right things, right? Like I'm really actually attempting to budget. I'm really writing down a plan for my money and I'm still doing things like overdrafting. And so I started to think about why was that the scenario? Why was that what was happening? And really what it came down to was the timing of our paychecks was not at all matching the budget that I was writing down. So basically when we write a monthly budget, we write all of our income at the top and then we write all of our expenses underneath it. And as long as that, income minus expenses works out to a positive number, we're like, great, the month is fine. And we kind of let it go. What actually happens if you're not paid, unless all of your income comes on the first of the month, what you wrote down is a summary of what will happen by the end of the month, but it doesn't at all map out the ebbs and flows of your income and your expenses during the month. So I'll repeat that again. A monthly income or a monthly budget, if you're not paid at the beginning of the month, is accurate about what will happen by the end of the month, but it's not at all accurate about what's going to happen during the month. So what I was finding was that by instead budgeting according to pay period, according to our paycheck, I became infinitely more accurate almost right away, because what I started to do was, instead of taking the month as a whole, when I was not at all, none of my incomes were paid on the first of the month. So I don't know what I was thinking, restarting my budget on the first of the month when we didn't get a single paycheck at all. My bank account on the 31st of the month looked absolutely no different than the first of the month, but I was trying to restart the budget. So instead, I started budgeting by pay period, where every time my husband's income at the time was our primary one, every time he got a paycheck, I would restart the budget. And then I would ask myself, what do I actually need to pay for during this pay period? From the time he gets paid on this pay period to 2 Fridays later, what do I actually need to take care of? And when I started mapping out our finances that way, it looked nothing like the monthly budget did, but it was so accurate because it was a plan in advance for exactly what was going to come in and out of our bank account and when. So that was the problem with my monthly budget, was it did not at all ask when would this income be available. And a budget by pay period included the variable of when is this money actually going to be available. And that's really when I started to see changes in my personal finances, was when I had an accurate budget that told me in advance how much money is there and what am I going to do with it. And sometimes I would have extra money left over in the pay period, and that's when we would put a payment on debt or, put money in savings. And other times within that 2-week window, the expenses that we were responsible for, whether it was like rent or at the time, like the car payment or whatever, would be larger than the income that would come in during that pay period. But because I was mapping it out well in advance, I was able to decide that an earlier pay period that had extra money available, I could use that income in the next pay period to cover it and make sure that I didn't run myself into a deficit. And so, again, I think in lots of industries, we're all doing this in our jobs, so like there's going to be times where in our businesses, my business and your business, where we have to spend more than we bring in order to just keep the business running. And personal finances are the same way, that in a short window of time, we are going to have more expenses than income, and we can map it out in advance. So we know when that's going to happen. We don't have to freak out. It's not a panic button moment if we know about it in advance. And as long as on the whole, if we zoom out and look at, multiple months or even a year, are we having a surplus overall in the long run, then we can be more comfortable with those momentary deficits because we know it's just a blip in time and it's not a trend on what's actually happening with our money. So that's where I could go on and on about this. That's where I really got passionate about sharing that tool with other people, because I think a lot of the frustration that people were pointing the finger at their income and saying my income's the problem, it was actually a problem of the way that they were looking at their money and how they were planning it out that made them feel like they didn't have enough money, even if they did.
I love it. I feel like I'm like part of the debt-free mom, like reels right now. It's great. So how do you maintain, it's so hard to get stuck in that, mindset of like, I don't have enough money. I don't have enough money. Like this stinks. How do you maintain a positive mindset around money, even when things do get a little wonky, if you will? It's so easy to just follow that dip down, even with your mindset, and just get frustrated, fed up, and want to quit.
Yeah. So a couple things. Number one, I talk a lot about contentment on Instagram. So my catchphrase is care creates contentment, which is if I feel discontent, I don't have to buy something in order to scratch that itch, so to speak. Like there are things I can do to create contentment, that I can actually invest a little bit of time into the thing that is causing my discontentment and create some contentment. I don't need to just sit in, okay, I don't like this couch and I'm just going to continue not liking it until I get a new one. I can actually create contentment around that couch. And so that's a big one for me is realizing I'm not a passive, my contentment is not something that's happening to me. It's something that I can decide and have influence over. So when I recognize discontentment in my life around my vehicle or my schedule or my food or my home, I can think about, 2 or 3 different small manageable tasks that will increase my contentment, that I can actually influence that. I think the way that we interact with social media is also a large part of that, that if we recognize that we are choosing to follow accounts where our only response to what we see from them is discontentment, we can choose to unfollow them. We are not bound into seeing what that random person who lives in a state far away, who we've never actually met, what DIY update they're doing today, or what trip they're going on tomorrow, or what new outfit they bought for the 100th time this month. We are not obligated to expose ourselves to that. And so if we have sources that we recognize, on the whole, this is creating far more discontentment than value that it's bringing to me. Sometimes it sounds silly, but I do this too. We forget that we can actually just choose to not see that. And so I've been really, have a very high bar for who I choose to follow. And I have a pretty quick unfollow button that I've, kind of flexed that muscle of, if I recognize that, yeah, every once in a while, I like what that person shares about that recipe, but on the whole, all I'm seeing is their $200,000 kitchen over and over and over. And then I walk into my rental kitchen and I feel discontentment. I just need to unfollow that person. Whatever random recipes I'm getting from them are not worth feeling like my house is not worthy to be lived in day after day after day. So that's a big one. And that contentment is there's lots of things we can do to increase that contentment. And then when it comes to having moments in your finances that feel tight or feel sad, or, they create envy when you're looking at other people. I think recognizing that that is normal is a huge step towards being content with it. I think one of the big disservices we do to ourselves about our money is to think that if something like that happens, like if an unexpected expense happens and we have to use money from our savings in order to cover it, that it means we did something wrong. And that is, I believe, that is actually what creates the downward spiral, is if we have something happen and we're like, well, I messed it up again, I might as well just forget the budget, forget trying to put money in savings because it doesn't work. That's what actually creates the spiral, not the unexpected expense at the beginning. It was what we chose to do about it or think about it that actually created the spiral. So for me, recognizing that life is far too unpredictable and messy and chaotic, and sometimes just downright hard and unfair, to create a budget and then assume that it has to happen exactly this way. And if it doesn't happen exactly this way, it means that I did something wrong. Instead, thinking, I'm going to make out this plan with the best information that I have at the time, but things are going to happen that I don't yet know about, that I can't yet predict. And when those things happen, I'm going to be flexible and come up with a plan B and come up with a plan C. That, for me, is what stops the spiral. When I recognize something unexpected does not mean that anyone did anything wrong. It just means we're living life. Like, our lives are messy. If we think about our life, remove the money side of it and just think about our calendar. If I wrote out in detail my whole calendar for the week, how much of that would actually be what happens in that order at that time? Very little of it, right? And I don't go about my life thinking like, oh my gosh, like I wrote down that we're going to go to the pool at 1 and we went at 3. I am not good at this. I might as well not even try to have a calendar. No, we don't do that. We're just like, yeah, I thought we would go at 1 and instead we went at 3 because, the kids were chaotic and then somebody knocked on the door. Like, we accept that as normal when we think about it with our calendar. But when we turn and look at our money, we're like, oh, well, that means I'm terrible at money. That means I'm terrible at budgeting, and there's no point. It can really help us to stick it out for the long term when we start to completely separate my skills in money management from something unexpected happening. Those are two different things.
Great tips. And so, I already obviously know the answer to this, but I'm just going to ask you anyways, what do you do when those unexpected expenses come up? What is your rule of thumb for having, I know you have an emergency fund and you have savings, which are two different things. So if you want to talk a little bit about what your rule of thumb is for holding that emergency fund, and, how you differentiate between your emergency fund and your savings accounts.
Sure. So I think, if we think back to when we were like kids or as we were getting older and our parents told us to have, a checking account and savings, and they kind of said things like, always put 10% of your check in savings, whatever, and never use it. That was like the big, I don't know what it was about that time, that era, what it was, but that was kind of what, as I talked to other people, that's kind of what we were all told. Put this percent into savings and never touch it. I don't know about you, but I am highly unmotivated by that because it basically feels like just reduce your income by 10% and never see it again. Never do anything with it. It doesn't provide any benefit to you. You're not supposed to touch it. So I have found that most of the people who were told that as they started, their first jobs and things like that have almost nothing in savings. Like they're not doing it. And it just is not because there's no incentive to that structure at all.
Hello, ladies. If you have been here for a bit now, you know that I am constantly on the go. Oh, yeah. And I have 3 school-age children with germs everywheres. Cue Wonder Cow Colostrum. This made in America bovine colostrum is top notch. I have been taking it for some time now, and the difference has been amazing. My immune system has a much easier time fighting off germs. My gut health, top notch. And I've been feeling great. I take in a bottle of water every morning as part of my daily routine. So, if you are a busy mom on the go and don't have time for germs, go to wondercow.com and get some today. P.S. Use code DGV10 and save yourself some dollars.
So for me, what savings should actually be is that it should have specific purposes, specific names, and specific amounts. So instead of perpetually put 10% in savings, change it to, I want to have 1 month of expenses in an emergency fund. And the only time I'm going to touch that is when I don't have enough income in my checking account to cover something that I need to cover. So for most people, that's going to be somewhere between $6,000 to $12,000 in the emergency fund, broad strokes speaking. Obviously, whoever's outside of that range is going to be like, that's not me. But broad strokes, that's about what it looks like to have a 1 month emergency fund. And that might sound excessive to someone who currently has $700 in their savings. But what happens when we have that money is not just about the math of, oh, well, I don't need 10,000 in my emergency fund because I've never had an unexpected expense that was 10,000. That's not actually the point. And to illustrate why that's not the point, there's 2 different scenarios. If you have, let's say you have $500 in savings and your AC goes out at your house and the cost of the repair is $300. So you have $500 in savings and your repair is $300. That is over 50% of your savings. And you're not going to want to do that. That just feels dangerous or feels bad, or you're going to be like, well, I can't use my savings because then I'm only going to have $200 left. So what do? We finance it. We put it on a credit card. We pull it from something else. We try to pick up extra jobs in order to cover it. But we feel like even though we have $500 in our savings, which is more than what the repair is, we could fully cover the repair. We feel like that's a bad choice. So we don't do it. And so we find other ways to do it, even if that means financing on something that like a credit card that has 28% interest. We would rather do that than pull 60% of our savings out. Now, if that same person had that $300 repair and had $5,000 in savings instead of $500, when we start to look at that and we say, okay, I could use $300 out of my $5,000 savings, and I would still have over 80% of my savings sitting there. I would use less than 20% or less than 10%, actually. Less than 10% of my savings would come out in order to cover this. That person makes a faster decision and they make a wiser decision because they don't feel afraid of using less than 10% of their savings in order to cover this repair. So they don't put it on a credit card. They don't panic about, picking up overtime shifts and selling all their furniture and whatever. And they don't try to not repair their AC. They go ahead and do it. So that person has a calmer approach and more options. And that is what I'm all about. I want it to not be a crisis every time something breaks. And I want to have the option to pay for something where the bank is not going to benefit because my AC went out, where I don't have to pay someone else interest. And so that's my approach to emergency funds, is not asking the question, what is the minimum? That's what everybody comes to me saying, like, what can I scrape by with? What can I get away with having? What's that smallest emergency fund that I can have and then use all the money for other things? And I instead ask, what is the amount that would feel so comfortable that I can handle unexpected expenses without having trouble sleeping that night? That if something happened, I could write a check for it and go to bed knowing that my finances are still comfortable even after having to take care of something. So like I said, for most people, that looks like starting out with about 1 month of expenses in an emergency fund before you start paying off debt, before you start doing other things, because the emergency fund is what will actually change what you do in the future. So a lot of times when people are stressed about their finances, they're like, oh, I just need to pay off my debt. I have this high interest credit card. If I pay off my debt, it all goes away. All the problems are solved. Paying off the debt will clean up what happened in the past. It will fix what you did 2 years ago. It will not change what you do in the future. And whatever you put on the credit card in the last 2 to 5 years is going to happen again. It's going to come up again, whether it's something that you want to buy or an unexpected charge, like a car repair or something. Those things are going to happen in the future. So in order to fix that debt problem, we don't first need to clean up what already happened. We actually first need to decide how we're going to change what we do in the future. And an emergency fund actually does change what we will do in the future. And so that's why that comes first, because it will prevent us from going back into debt and it will change our approach to those decisions in the future. So save up 1 month of emergency fund before you do anything else. Pay off high interest debt, which to me is 10% interest or higher, and then come back to that emergency fund and say, instead of just trying to scrape by with this 1 month emergency fund, how can I beef it up so high that even if I lost my job, I would not panic? And so for most people, that looks like 3 to 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund. And I say expenses, not income. It's not your paycheck. It's what you would actually continue to pay, even if you had a job loss. So I like to go through the budget and kind of highlight, okay, imagine that we have zero income, that all of our paychecks for some reason all went away. What would we still continue to pay for? So that would look like food. That would look like housing. That would look like transportation of some kind. That would look like all your medical expenses. What would utilities, keep the lights on. What would I keep paying even if I had zero income? Add that up, and that's your 1 month of necessary expenses. And then multiply that by 3 to 6 to see kind of where you fall. So for reference, where my family is currently at is we have about 4 months of necessary expenses in an emergency fund. And it truly does help me sleep at night, because I know that even if something happened to our income or a large unexpected expense came our way, I could pay for it without creating a debt payment situation. And then I would give myself the gift of time to come up with, how am I going to pivot? Am I going to have to pick up a part-time job in order to refill that emergency fund? Am I going to have to sell things? Are we going to have to do something different? But I give myself the gift of time. It's not a crisis that I have to solve immediately. I can pay for the unexpected expense and then take time to figure out what I'm going to pivot towards. So that's why an emergency fund to me is, I've said this before, if I had to pick between being in debt with an emergency fund and being debt-free with no emergency fund, I would choose being in debt with an emergency fund every time.
I love it. That's such a great way of, comparing the numbers as far as what chunk of your emergency fund it takes to fix something. Mm-hmm. And when you have that larger number, it makes such a difference mm-hmm. for those, unexpected expenses, because, oh my gosh, I have to spend all my savings on this, is very, life altering, keeps you up at night kind of thing, and then comparing it into the big number, while it seems, it could seem very unattainable, it's totally attainable if you put your mind to it and work at it. But I really love that analogy that you have. So what tips would you have, so rural women, especially if you're relying on a farm income is very cyclical, very uncontrolled, so if you don't necessarily know what that paycheck is going to be every time, how do you go about making a budget and sticking to it when you don't have those, you don't get the same paycheck month after month?
Sure. So I will say, for those who are listening and don't know me, I'm not a farmer, obviously, but I have highly variable income because I'm fully self-employed. So our income does come from this business, what I'm doing right now. And it is, if we run a big sale on something, I'll have a larger paycheck than I ever could have imagined. And then the very next paycheck could be $400, right? So I am very accustomed to these big highs and lows that I know it's going to be variable, but I don't yet know, usually until like about a week before I pay myself, what exactly that paycheck is going to be. So in those scenarios, first of all, the more variable our income, the more savings we need to have on hand, because we kind of need to be our own insurance plan against those lower than normal paychecks where we predicted a high paycheck and it did not work out that way. We need to have a plan B, because while we don't know exactly what our paycheck is going to be, we do know that it's variable. So we need to act on the information that we have. So if we know that it's variable, we can do things about it. So I don't know what my paycheck is going to be further than, like I said, 1 to 2 weeks in advance, but I do know that I have savings on hand, and that if it, for some reason, it ends up being much lower than I thought it was going to be, I do have ways to pay for everything that our family needs and adjust to that lower paycheck. So that's one thing, is that the more variable your income, the more savings you need to have on hand, because those ebbs and flows are just going to be normal. The second thing is that for people with highly variable income, and in our custom budget work where we build budgets for other people, I have built budgets for farmers before. And one of the things I recommend to them is to kind of reverse engineer the budget. And what that means is fill out the budget according to how frequently you tend to pay yourself, but don't put anything in the income, zero income. I just want to see, in each window of time, in each pay period, so to speak, what do we expect to need to pay for? What are the bills, and what is the normal spending? Because I don't want to only see your utility bills and your cell phone bill and your groceries. I want to see, like, how much do you normally spend on entertainment? How much do you normally spend for your kids' clothes? How much do you normally spend on, pet supplies? How much do you normally spend on household stuff? Do you have people over and you like to host? I want to see what your normal day-to-day living looks like represented in the budget. And I don't want to put any income at the top. Because what that tells me is that once we start to find out what your paychecks are, we can immediately know, is this going to cover what I need to or not? So we're going to have an idea. So for example, if we have 3 pay periods in a row where your spending is going to look like $2,000 and then $3,200 and then $1,800. If I have that information ahead of time, then as soon as you find out what you're going to get paid, you can know just by looking at it, is it more than what, is it going to cover more than enough? Or is it going to be too small? And we can make that immediate assessment. So then we know, okay, my expenses in this pay period are $2,000. And I know that I set the budget up ahead of time. And now I just found out that my paycheck is $1,800. I can immediately move from, oh my gosh, my paycheck's too small. And, it's all going, it's all going away. I might as well get a different job. We can move away from that and immediately move into problem solving and say, okay, we have a deficit of $200. That's not that much. Number one, is there anything that I put into this budget expenses wise that I don't actually need to do? Where I was just like, oh, it would be nice to replace this thing, or it would be nice to have, $200 in personal spending cash, or whatever it is. Can I make small tweaks to a few of the categories to just shrink the deficit a little bit? So maybe we do that in a few categories and we reduce that deficit from $200 to $100, but we still have a deficit. So then, being someone who's highly variable income and needs to have savings on hand, we can say, all right, I don't mind pulling $100 from a savings account to supplement this paycheck that ended up being lower than I thought it was. And hopefully, as you can, as I'm talking through these hypotheticals, you can hear that I want you to have this even keel approach to it. It should be this very rational decision-making of, sometimes I'm higher and sometimes I'm lower, and I'm going to make these pivots. I'm going to make these plan B decisions based on what I see, but I'm not going to panic and freak out about it, because that is counterproductive to problem solving. So, we are highly adapted to have this adrenaline rush when we feel like something is a panic, and it keeps us alive, but it also cuts off our long-term thinking. It completely prevents us from thinking about what is good in the long term because we're just trying to stay alive in the moment. And I want to get away from that kind of adrenaline that, fight or flight feeling about our finances. And so that's what the emergency fund offers us. That's what the budget offers us. That's what thinking through alternatives in advance offers us, is the ability to be calm and rational about something that we used to panic about. And when we panic, we kind of turn off that long-term thinking part of our brain. And so thinking about those plan Bs and plan Cs and plan Ds before they actually happen can help us to be calm and rational about it. So for people who are highly variable income, we need to work with the information that we have. And if we don't know how much we're going to get paid, we can know what we're expecting to spend, and we can know that it's going to be variable. So we want to work on those things that we do know. So that looks like writing that, that reverse engineered budget where we just say, okay, I don't know what my income is going to be, but I do know what all these expenses are. And then also having that savings in advance. And one thing that I do recommend to highly variable income households is, on top of the emergency fund, have something like a payroll reserve. So for some reason, people are just really, really adverse to pulling money from an account that they call their savings or they call their emergency fund. But if we have a savings account that is separate from that and we call it our paycheck reserve, we say the primary function of this savings account is to cover me when my paycheck is lower than I think it would be, that feels better, right? Like that is just like, okay, the whole point of this account is to help me out when my savings is lower than I thought I would be. So when we have that gap where we say my expenses are $2,000, but my income is only $1,800, we have no problem grabbing $200 out of that payroll reserve and plopping it into our
Barnyard
checking
Language
account to cover
Podcast
it.
is honest
So
talk
sometimes
about
just
running
the
farms and
name
raising
of
families.
something,
Hosted
what
by
we
us,
call it,
Katie
or
and
what we
Arlene, an
decide
Iowa
it's
sheep
there
farmer
for,
and an
can
Ontario
really
dairy
change
farmer
what
with
we're
6
willing
kids,
to
2
do with it
husbands,
as
and a
well.
whole
So
lot
that's
of
a really
chaos
good
between
thing
us.
for someone who's
We
highly
talk to guests who
variable,
have life
is on top of the
experience that's
emergency
relatable
fund,
to
have
parents in
a
agriculture
payroll
and offer
reserve that we
resources,
just say the
perspective,
whole point of
compassion,
this
a
is
few
to help me
swears,
out
and lots
when
of
my paycheck
laughs.
is low.
Whether your
And
farm is a
sometimes
raised
that
bed in your
can be,
backyard or 10,000
that can be all we
acres.
need
Whether
to kind
your
of flip the
family is in the
switch
planning
on what we do
stages or
with
you've
that
got a
variable
dozen
income.
kids.
If you've ever had a car seat in
Awesome.
a
Those are all
combine, a
such
stroller
great
in a
tips,
stable,
Carly. I
or
really
you have a toddler or a
appreciate
teen in your
that.
tractor, this is the
You know, I
podcast
hope
for
that we
you.
can help
Subscribe to
some
Barnyard Language
people
today
out
on your favorite
by them
podcast
listening
platform.
to this and inspire them to,
I guess with
you
that,
know,
what
make the most
last
out of
minute
their
tips
money and
do you
really
have
be able to
for,
fine tune
you know,
it so
for the
that
rural
they
mom
can make
trying
steps
to
towards
hit
their
money?
goals.
Yeah.
So
So, first of all, if you're variable income, most people who have highly variable income, they often will come to me and say, there's no point in budgeting because my income is variable. And I like to throw back to them, you need to budget more than anyone else. And so my advice is that when we have highly variable situations, whether our expenses are variable or our income is variable, either in the timing of when we're paid or how much we're paid, what that means is that we even more so than people who have really set salaries and really set expenses, which is much fewer people than we think. Everybody everybody who has variable income likes to point to this kind of ghost situation of like, oh, well, their paycheck is the same every month and they don't have this variability. That might be true in that one little piece, but there's lots of other things that could be variable about their situation. So I very rarely actually build a budget where every pay period is just the same, one after another. It looks the same, both in expenses and income. So I'll say that first of all. But when you have that variability, what we need to do is we need to map out what we know. So budgeting for someone who is variable income is even more helpful than someone budgeting who has salaried income. So do not exclude yourself from budgeting simply because you have variable income. It's actually going to be even more beneficial to you than to someone who has a set salary. So that's what I'll say. And then as far as being a rural mom, somebody who's managing finances in an area where we don't have a million museums or an ocean or mountains to run off to, is that if you look, there are so many more options than we might believe. So I think that what, rural, small town kind of areas do better than cities is offering free parks and library programs. And, if you just Google free things to do and then fill in your area or your city, you're probably going to be surprised at what is there. So that's what I'll say. First of all, libraries are amazing. I have a whole podcast episode interviewing my personal library director, just asking her, what do libraries offer? Because they have a lot more than we think. It's way more than books. Another one is that what adults think that kids want to do is different than what kids actually want to do. So don't feel like you're somehow limiting the experiences that your kids are having because they don't live in a city, because they don't live close to the ocean or the mountains or whatever it is. Give the kids the hose and some grass, and you're probably not going to see them for 2 hours. Right. So I think that that's something I'm guilty of a lot, is imposing on my kids, oh, they really want to do this, or they really need to go do this scheduled activity. So we need to go to the trampoline park. And then the next day we need to go to the zoo. The kids don't actually want to do that stuff. So do not at all think that because you live in a more rural setting than others, that you're somehow limiting their experiences. I think that unplanned, unscheduled, free roam, free range kids is where it's at. I think that develops them into such well-rounded adults who have problem-solving skills, who have social skills, who can occupy themselves, who don't have, they're not jumping on a screen every time they feel a momentary boredom. And so I love that about where we live and what our kids are doing and how much time they spend outside making up games and all that kind of stuff. And we love to visit cities. We love to go to museums and do that. But at the same time, I've kind of, over time, now being in my 10th year of parenting, I've kind of looked at those places as we visited them and thought, I wouldn't really want to raise kids here. I wouldn't, the crowd and the noise and everywhere you go, you're waiting in this many hours of traffic. I don't think that is the ideal. I don't think that is what, the most well-rounded kids should want to do, and that we're somehow limiting them by being less, being farther away from some of those things. So I love where we live, and I hope that people listening can kind of get a reminder that they can love where they live too. Actually, the mug I'm drinking out of for my coffee says, "Love where you live."
I love it. And definitely I agree with you as far as, raising your children in a rural area. I mean, just being on the farm, we call them the feral kids. They just run and do whatever, and they're on their bikes and they're out. I bought like a little $2 sprinkler that goes on the end of one of the hoses that I water the horses with. And they just love it. And they'll occupy themselves for a long time with it. And it's the things that they come up with, even on muddy days, and they find puddles, and it's like, it's okay. The clothes wash, the kids wash. It's okay. Just let them have fun.
Yeah. I love it.
Even the dog gets in on that one. It makes things entertaining. Never a dull moment. So I love to get into some rapid fire questions at this point in the episode, just to get to know a little bit more about our guests and have some fun while answering. So what is your go-to comfort food?
Comfort food, like late at night after the kids have gone to bed and I want to have a snack, is chips and queso.
Oh, I'm here for the queso. Always queso. Let's see. So we are into July. July is National Ice Cream Month for those that are into dairy. What is your favorite ice cream flavor?
Anything with peanut butter in it. So if I'm eating ice cream that doesn't have peanut butter in it, I will take a scoop of peanut butter out of the jar and add it to it. So like a Rocky Road or a peanut butter. There's one that a local place has that's like, it's turtle. So it has like the caramel and the pecans and the chocolate, but it also has peanut butter. And that's my favorite.
Oh, that's delicious. That does sound delicious. You'd get right along in our household with the peanut butter ice cream.
Peanut butter, good.
Yep. If you could live anywhere else in the world, where would you live? Like dream, like,
yeah.
So
I have not actually gone there yet, so I can't say with certainty, but in a couple weeks, I'm actually going to London for the very first time. Leaving the country for the very first time. And currently, before having gone there, that is what I imagine I would like. English countryside is where I would hop over to and live. I always think, like, if I could can you do like a year abroad in your 40s? If I could, that's what I would do.
You can do whatever you want. So I've been to England before, and I actually am I read a ton of novels, because when I can't read anything that's too intense, too crazy. I love 1800s British novels is where it's at for me.
Yes.
And my mom and I have this thing. She sends me, she's on, and I have not joined the Facebook group at this point because I need to limit my craziness on Facebook, but she sends me castles that are for sale in England, France, and Italy usually.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, do you think we could make this one work? And I was like, oh, I totally can make that work. There's
Yeah.
only 30. I was like, but wait, the bathroom number is a little small. It only has 30 bathrooms to 37 bedrooms. So, I mean, it's a touch small, you know.
Somebody
But
might be sharing.
Yes. So, I mean, you can totally get in on when we, you know, when we just randomly buy a castle in England, we'll put you on the invite.
I'm there.
Plenty of rooms for everybody, and our kids can just go nuts, right?
Yes, I would love that.
To that one. And let's see, your favorite holiday tradition. I like that one.
So it's definitely around Christmas time. That's when I'm not a super sentimental person, but when it gets to Christmas time, I'm all about it. And there is a drive-through lights display in our local area that I grew up. I grew up in the town that I currently live in. And I grew up driving through that, and especially like in Christmas pajamas, going in the van, listening to Christmas music and driving through it. So I love now also taking my kids through that. The last 2 years, we've put Christmas lights inside the van so that the van is lit up while they're going through in their Christmas PJs. And I think that's something I'll always remember.
That is awesome. And I guess I have one more.
Okay.
What's your favorite place that you've ever visited?
Let's see. Probably San Diego, California, so these are two polar opposites in location, but I would say equally, I have best memories of New York City and San Diego, California. When Kyle and I lived in Phoenix for about a year, and we realized how close it was to the coast of California. So we did a couple of weekend trips. It's like only 5 hours from Phoenix to the coast. And I think it was for our anniversary, we drove out and did a weekend in San Diego and went out to Coronado Island and rode bikes along the coast. And I absolutely have amazing memories of that. And then New York City, I have been there at Christmas time twice, and it is magical.
It is. I'm 3 hours from the city, so I've been there twice now during holidays, and it really is, there's something about it. And if you have you seen the Rockettes yet?
We have not. No, I've walked in front of like radio, what is it called? Radio City Hall. Yeah. Yep. So I walked across there. We did right around the corner from that. We stood in, as the outside crowd for the Today Show. We did that. Yep. But yeah, I just like love everything is just like decorated, and every corner you turn around, it's like, oh, there's another cool, pretty thing. And so, yeah, I just love being there at Christmas time.
Well, 100% put the Rockettes on your list, because
next visit.
I have been obsessed with, you want to talk about holiday traditions? I have been obsessed with the Rockettes since I was a little kid, watching them on the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And I was like, someday I'm going to go see the Rockettes someday. And I mean, I'm not far from the city, but I was like, I need to just make this work. And now my daughters are 8. And my cousin and my mom and my aunt and we took the girls and we took the train down to the city, and we went to the Rockettes, and it was absolutely amazing. So cool. And it makes you you're like, is 35 too old to become a Rockette? I might try my back out, but it might be worth a try.
I've never done the splits, but I'll give it a go.
Nope, I will not be doing any splits. It's the high kicks for me. But anyway, well worth it. If anyone goes to New York City, the Rockettes, highly recommend. It was magical, if you will. So I also love to have like more of a deeper thought question that's been left anonymously by another guest. So if you like woke up tomorrow and had to completely change careers, like dream career, just nothing to do with anything that you do now, what would you do?
Behavioral psychology. I've thought about this a lot. So I used to say something with money. I actually, like my freshman year of college, I was majoring in accounting, but I was in a very aggressive business program at the University of Illinois. It's like number 2 in business schools. And I just that wasn't my aspiration to be like a, CFO or something. So I switched degrees, but I used to say something in money, but the longer I have been in what I do now, the more I've realized that what I'm actually most interested in is why people do the things they do and how to change what we assume about, oh, I have to do this or I can't do this. And so I think that if people follow me, that comes across a lot in what I talk about. I often get on these little rabbit trails of just talking about the reason that we do things. Critical thinking is very important to me, and that's a lot of times missing from things. And so, if I could just, erase it and go back to school for anything I wanted, it would be something around behavioral psychology of why we do the things we do and how we can impact those choices.
I mean, I can see it now that you said it, but it's totally not what I expected you to say, which is funny.
What did you expect? What did you think I would say?
I'm not really sure. I don't know what I expected, but that was not quite what I expected. But then once you said it and it sunk in, I was like, oh yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Awesome. So I love to leave a little bit of inspiration for my listeners. And, just that driving quote of why, what drives you to be the best person that you can be. So what do you have?
Yeah. So when you asked that, I was like, oh, I have to really think about that one. And a person came to mind before a specific quote. And so I thought of an author. Her name is Catherine Wolfe, and she runs a business now called Hope Heals. And when she was in her early 20s, she was this young, beautiful, like actual model. She modeled professionally, and she had a massive stroke that completely disabled her for life. And she has now runs this business called Hope Heals, just reaching out to people who are disabled or who have in some way their life pivots vastly different than what they expected it to. And she often talks about the good, hard life is what she calls it. And so I've talked about that before on Instagram too, of it's such a good reminder of those things, both of those things can be true, that something can be hard, but it can also be good. And I think especially in money, that's a good thing, is to remember that even if something feels temporarily difficult or challenging, it doesn't mean that it's bad or something we should run away from. So I did look up to try to actually find like a better quote than that from her. So this is from her. Her name's Catherine Wolfe, like I said. And she said, I choose to believe that the good story and the hard story can be the same story. So that's my quote.
I like it. And it resonates a lot with farming as well, because farming is one of those very tough careers where, you have rough days and rough days and rough days. And, but if you ask, most farmers would say they still wouldn't trade it for the world. And I think that definitely resonates with that quote.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
resonates with it for you.
Yeah. I think it just helps me to remember that just because something feels challenging in the moment or difficult, or if I look at other people's lives and I'm like, oh, well, they're not experiencing this hardship or this, this challenge or this difficulty, or, the way they handle their money, they don't say no to themselves at all. And I'm saying no to myself. It just reminds me that when something is hard, it can also be good. It can also be the right thing. It can also be the choice that like you said, that if I look back again, that I would still make that choice again. But I think often we kind of shy away from, as soon as I feel a negative emotion, I need to run away from it and try to prevent it from happening. And so I just like the way that she has that approach, where she has a much, much harder life than me and went through something much more traumatic than what I have ever gone through. And she has this perspective of, okay, my life looks nothing like what I expected it to look, and it can also be good. And so that's a good reminder to me for both contentment and for, the way I handle my money, and just broader the way I look at my life, that when something feels, parenting is not always easy. It's actually mostly hard, but it's still also good. And so I just love that combination, just putting those two things together and saying that they're not opposites, that something being good and something being hard are not the opposite of each other. They can be the same story, as she says.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love it. I have so enjoyed chatting with you today. I think it's the coolest thing that I got to have you on the podcast. So do you want to share with people where they can find you?
Sure. So the place I show up the most by far is Instagram. So that's at debtfree.mom. So debtfree period MOM. But I also have a podcast. So if people are listening and they're like avid podcast listeners, but they're not on Instagram, I have the Debt Free Mom podcast. You can find that wherever you're listening to this. It will also be there. And then my website is debtfreemom.co. That has all of our other stuff of what we do, blog, and has our services, the template, the budget template that I kind of described here on this episode is also on there as well. So those are the three main places you can find me: Instagram, podcast, and website.
Awesome. I highly recommend following Carly. She is a fantastic mother and a fantastic inspiration for managing money and doing those things that are hard. So I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for listening today. We will see you next week. Remember, if you loved this podcast, loved this episode, please share with a friend so that more people can learn and be a part of it. So have a great day. Thank you so much.